After 30 years in power and months of unrest, Hosni Mubarak is forced to resign as president of Egypt. It's the beginning of a new chapter for the most populous Arab nation. 2012 is widely viewed as a transition between former and new regimes. The first post-Mubarak parliamentary elections see the overwhelming victory of Islamist parties. The Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party wins 44% of the seats. Hardline Salafist Noor Party comes second with 25%. Liberals and secular groups land on the opposition benches. The Assembly's opening session takes place on January 23rd. The new Egyptian Assembly is in charge of drafting a new constitution. But without a president, the Council of Armed Forces led by Marshal Tantawi is still ruling the country. As impatience among the population is growing, the army accepts to hand over power to a civilian government right after the election of a new president. On May 23rd, Egyptians go to the polls for the first democratic elections in the history of the country. Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi is declared winner of the presidential election. Meanwhile, the trial of former Egypt's leader Hosni Mubarak is ongoing. The verdict is anxiously awaited by Egyptians. On June 2nd, Mubarak is sentenced to life in prison for complicity in the killing of protesters during the revolution. He escapes the death sentence. June 14th, military rulers order the dissolution of the assembly. The move triggers another political crisis in the country. Egyptians fear the army is trying to hang on to power. The generals are in charge since the fall of Mubarak. Three days after the dissolution of parliament, military rulers strip the president of key powers. The country leader is no longer the supreme commander of the armed forces. The president cannot get Egypt into war based on his sole decision. It is up to the council, where the military outnumbers civilians. Banned under Mubarak's regime, the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party wins the presidential election. The transition is over between ousted leader Mubarak and the new president Morsi. Egypt begins a new era, dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Mohammed Morsi is officially sworn in as president of Egypt on June 30th. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces hands over power during a military ceremony in Cairo. Egypt now has a new president, but is still awaiting its constitution. The economy continues to collapse and Egyptians are losing patience. The first Muslim Brotherhood government takes office on August 2nd. The very unpopular chief of the armed forces, Marshal Tantawi, is appointed defense minister. However, 10 days later, Mohammed Morsi orders his retirement. The Egyptian president offers him the job of presidential advisor, but experts suggest it's a deal struck between Morsi and the generals. On September 26th, the new elected president of Egypt addresses the United Nations Assembly in New York. In his speech, he strongly rejects any military intervention to solve the conflict in Syria. He also voices support for dismantling weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. At the same time, he believes that countries in the region should have the right to develop nuclear energy. The country still has not adopted a constitution. Images from Cairo show a country divided into two and on the edge of a civil war. Clashes erupt between anti- and pro-Morsi protesters during demonstrations. The issue is the presidential decree of November 22nd, which grants sweeping powers to the head of state. For Morsi's supporters, it's a way to speed up the adoption of a new constitution. His opponents see a forcing attempt and the threat of a dictatorship. The adoption of a new constitution is subject to a referendum. The charter protects each citizen against arbitrary detention and torture. However, the document restricts freedom of expression and religion. Civilians can still stand trial in front of a military court. The opposition calls for a no vote. The first leg of the referendum is set for December 15th, but many judges supposed to supervise the polls are calling for a boycott. However, the constitution is likely to be approved after the end of the second round on December 22nd, unless magistrates manage to void the charter. After a year of transition, 2013 will probably